Hello, dear viewers. A big thank you to everyone who took the time to join us here in the studio. Today, we have a guest we haven't seen in 11 months. Alexander Ivanovich, welcome.
Time flies so fast, doesn't it?
Indeed, time flies so fast, Alexander Ivanovich. Our previous episodes have been watched over 1.2 million times. This has been absolutely confirmed. And that's just on one of the popular video platforms. Some episodes are more popular than others, but there's a huge number of comments everywhere. This should be understood and interpreted as evidence that the topics you discuss here are genuinely interesting to people. Over the past year, Alexander Ivanovich, what have you brought to share with us today?
I think we've already examined the most significant aspects of the moon hoax, as such. Of course, we could continue discussing it, but that wouldn't add anything new of substance. I believe that 1970 is a very intriguing year. It's something of a turning point in the moon race, when our leadership shifted from implied consent regarding moon missions to a somewhat passive yet quite evident form of cooperation.
Cooperation with whom?
Cooperation with the competitor. It's a very unusual situation. Of course, one should in no way accuse the leadership of a lack of intelligence or anything like that. Clearly, there were specific interests involved. I think this is worth discussing. And the most striking episode is the one that occurred in Murmansk, where in September 1970, Apollo found itself at the pier, and our comrades in trench coats handed over an Apollo capsule to the officers of an arriving American icebreaker.
In the closed city of Murmansk, Alexander Ivanovich.
Yes, in the closed city of Murmansk. Interestingly, I spoke today with one of the veterans who worked on the N-1 rocket in Buran during Korolyov's time. I asked him if he knew about this story, and he said he had no idea. I think the story of Apollo at the Murmansk pier is worth telling.
Excellent title. Over to you, Alexander Ivanovich.
Once again, I want to emphasize that this is an absolutely astonishing story. If considered in isolation from certain other significant events of the moon race, it would be very hard to believe. Therefore, staying within the context of 1970, I want to dedicate my account to two puzzling decisions made by the Soviet leadership. Puzzling in quotes, because they later become understandable. My main story will focus on the second decision, Apollo at the Murmansk pier. But first, I want to talk about the peculiar decision made by our Soviet leadership regarding our space program in 1970. To make sure I don't forget to mention this along the way, I'd like to note up front that it seems as though there were two groups within our leadership. It's not that there was a clear dividing line between them. Of course, there were nuances and transitions, but one side was driving the space program forward, while the other found plausible and rational reasons to ensure that our achievements weren't utilized to their full potential. The first cancelled success was the manned flyby of the moon. I want to point out that even today, if we suddenly heard such an announcement, whether from the Americans, showing unmistakable and convincing lunarscapes, or from the Chinese, or even from us, it would leave a tremendous impression. Of course, Americans would say that they had made such flyby for the second time. Nevertheless, it still remains a highly prestigious accomplishment. And yet, we were genuinely prepared for this mission 50 years ago. From 1967 to 1970, the USSR was preparing for a manned lunar flyby. This was the 7KL-1 manned spacecraft, illustrated below. Incidentally, its front section closely resembles our Soyuz spacecraft, and rightly so. As Korolyov's associate, academician Chertok, Aptly put it, the Soyuz spacecraft has lunar origin because it was designed for the Moon flyby mission. True to our tradition, we first tested all technical solutions on unmanned missions. These were similar spacecraft, but unmanned, called Zond. There were many difficulties and failures. However, in the end, the effort paid off, and we achieved success. Take a look at the magnificent Earth images sent back by our Zond spacecraft. In 1968, Zond 5 returned from the Moon, approached Earth, and captured this photograph. The resolution is exceptionally high because it wasn't transmitted via a telemetry channel. These were taken with cameras on film, which was brought back to Earth, developed, and turned into full-fledged photographs. A key point is that the film was successfully returned to Earth. While a typical low Earth orbit satellite travels at about 8 kilometers per second, a spacecraft returning from the Moon comes back at 11 kilometers per second, and energy increases quadratically, doubling the challenge. The task of atmospheric re-entry at the escape velocity was solved by us, whereas, as far as I know, the Americans have yet to solve it. Zond 5 returned with photographs in 1968, and in 1969, Zond 7 brought back color photographs. These images were taken on the return journey from a distance of approximately 70 to 90,000 kilometers. They are stunning, showing the Mediterranean Sea, North Africa, and Saudi Arabia. Truly remarkable photographs. While flying by the Moon at an altitude of about 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers, Zond 7 captured incredible images of Earthrise over the lunar horizon. As it flew over the Moon, Earth appeared over the horizon, allowing for some amazing pictures. Interestingly, you can see the Moon has a brownish tint in these images. Zond 8, 1970. This is the last Zond I want to talk about. However, there weren't many completely successful Zond missions. Success came only at the very end. It returned to Earth with black and white photographs. It's worth noting that for many scientific purposes, particularly cartography, black and white photography is better because it offers higher resolution than color images. By the time 2 manned spacecraft with trained crews were ready, the first decree came. As you can see here, it mentions 1969 and 1970. There is no exact date when the Politburo allegedly made this decision. Such a date doesn't exist. Over those years, they pushed against this mission and finally, at the end of 1970, they said, "No, we won't go. We don't want to be second. We're proud, we don't want to be second." I must say that at the time, I perceived it in the same way. It's indeed frustrating to always be second. But later, life taught me to think differently. Consider this. In 1957, we launched the first artificial satellite. Did the Americans say, "Oh, now we're second, we don't want to be second. We won't launch satellites, we'll find other fields to explore"? We sent the first human into space, the first woman, and accomplished many other firsts. We were the first to hit the Moon with a rocket. Gritting their teeth, the Americans worked hard to catch up. They were behind the USSR but were willing to be second. Finally, consider a more recent example. Just 5 years ago or so, China sent a rover to the Moon and then returned with lunar soil. But wait, we did that 50 years ago. So why are the Chinese doing it now? The law of progress is clear. If you fall behind, you must catch up. That's why I view the argument, "we don't want to be second," as an excuse. In reality, most of the costs had already been incurred. They were spent on research and development, on testing. 2 spacecraft were ready. The psychological impact of a Moon flyby would have been immense. Our cosmonauts were brave, but not so reckless as to board a spacecraft that was likely to crash. They wrote to the Central Committee or perhaps to a party congress taking place at the time. I might be mixing up the details. Writing letters to the party congress was also common then. I don't remember exactly. They wrote that they were prepared and ready to go, ending their letter with, "Permit us to go." But the response was, "No, we don't want to be second." This was the first puzzling decision. Who benefited from it? In any case, the Americans received it with satisfaction. I want to illustrate how state leaders viewed this through 3 quotes. From top to bottom, U.S. President John F. Kennedy, Khrushchev, Brezhnev's predecessor, and Brezhnev himself. The common theme, especially among the Americans, was that leadership in space meant leadership on Earth. John F. Kennedy: if we are to win the battle between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space should have made clear to us all the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere, who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. Khrushchev understood this and briefly said, "Do not surrender the moon to the Americans," especially since there was a very real chance of not surrendering it. Moon landings are still fantastical even today. It's no coincidence that NASA regularly announces that a return to the moon is imminent, unveiling new moon programs, only to later cancel them. This has been going on for decades, but we were ready to do the moon flyby, yet we chose not to. In 1964, Nikita Khrushchev was succeeded by Brezhnev, and under his leadership, the mood began to shift. When Korolev passed away, his successor Vasily Mishin took over the lead at OKB-1, now known as Corporation Energia, the principal Soviet space design bureau. In his book, Why Didn't We Go to the Moon?, Mishin provides an intriguing insight. Even Korolev, with his authority, would have found it difficult to work without the support of Soviet leadership, which even during his lifetime, prior to his death in 1966, pursued an unclear policy. The second important and puzzling decision was made during this time, one connected to Apollo 13 and its subsequent fate. First, let's look at the situation regarding the moon race. According to American propaganda, this was the peak of moon missions. 2 years of flights had already taken place, in 1968–1969, including the alleged first moon landing. There were 2 more years of missions ahead, 1971–72. And on April 11, 1970, Apollo 13 was launched. In the photograph below, you can see the conical-shaped Apollo spacecraft. But there's a caveat: Apollo as a spacecraft didn't truly exist. The astronauts are in white suits, supposedly headed to the moon. Apollo 13 was the only mission of the Apollo program announced by NASA in 1970. Let's take note of that. We're not discussing the mission itself, its authenticity, or other aspects right now. Our focus is on Murmansk. Our sources. In the top left corner is a photo of the Apollo capsule being handed over at the Murmansk pier. This took place in 1970. Besides military officers from both sides and U.S. Embassy staff, there was one independent witness, a Hungarian photojournalist. No Soviet photographers or journalists were invited. There were 2 Hungarians present, Tomasz Fehir and Nandor Shuminsky. It seems Fehir took the photos, while Shuminsky later promoted this information. In 1981, under Shuminsky's editorship, Hungary published the Encyclopedia of Astronautics, which stated that in 1970, Soviet authorities handed over the command module of the Apollo spacecraft to the Americans. How did he dare to publish this, and who allowed it? After all, this was supposed to be a classified story. The fact is, cracks had already begun to appear in the Soviet bloc. Perestroika was approaching, and naturally, Allied ties and secrecy weakened. They published this photograph. However, it made little impression on the global public for one simple reason. How many people in the world know Hungarian? It's an exceptionally rare language. Today, we have internet-based translation tools, but they didn't exist back then. I remember, even 10 years ago, struggling to find an accessible Hungarian translator when I needed to translate something from Hungarian. Without the Hungarians, this story might have remained entirely unknown to us. The Hungarians didn't stop there and began pestering the editor of the American online encyclopedia Astronautics, Mark Wade, pictured in the middle. Under their pressure, Wade published a lengthy article in 2002, showing this scene but mostly discussing polar bears and the challenges of walking in the Arctic. Essentially, it turned into an adventure story. In short, he glossed over the issue. For the Americans, this is an awkward story. What was Apollo doing in Murmansk? In 2002, Alexander Zheleznyakov picked up where Wade left off and published an article titled, "A Forgotten Episode of the Cold War Era." This article, with minor variations, has been reprinted several times. Since Zheleznyakov followed American templates, essentially echoing Wade's arguments, perhaps with some added local flavor, I will cite him. He writes in Russian, making it easier to quote from his work. Now, about the group of researchers who, as part of the broader study of the moon hoax, examined this issue. We are moving on to the main topic, Apollo at the Murmansk pier. This was a Soviet-American affair where both the red Soviet flag and the American stars and stripes participated on roughly equal terms. My presentation is based on the works of many authors. I will mention only the most prominent: Bulatov, Vel-Yurev, Vizitov, Mezuyev, Kropotov, Nasenyik, Polivanov, yours truly A.Popov, and other researchers. I emphasize Vel-Yurov's name because he was one of the first in Russia to draw attention to this episode and suggest that it might be connected to the Apollo 13 mission. Let us delve into the episode itself. What was so extraordinary about it? The first remarkable aspect is that, for the first time in 25 years since the end of World War II, a U.S. military ship made a call at Murmansk. During the war, Murmansk was probably the main port through which Lend-Lease aid arrived. Naturally, the convoys were escorted by military ships, but as soon as the war ended and the Soviet Union was no longer needed as a restrainer of Hitler, the aid immediately ceased, and no American ship ever called at Murmansk again. And suddenly, on September 5, 1970, an American ship arrives, a fairly large one, just 10 meters short of 100, with a crew of over 200. She was a U.S. Coast Guard icebreaker Southwind, armed and equipped with 2 helicopters, making her indeed a military vessel. Her route across the Atlantic is shown here. She departed, and this is also an important date, from Baltimore on the east coast of the United States on June 15, 1970, a warm port and a pleasant area. She headed to the Arctic, what we then called the Soviet Arctic. The route through the Atlantic is shown schematically. What matters is what the icebreaker was doing near Murmansk. She meandered significantly there, and to avoid confusion, I highlighted the relevant section in brown. The light brown arrow indicates how the icebreaker moved along the coast of northern Norway. She passed one of Norway's northernmost cities, Tromsø, reached the northernmost point, and seemed like she might head to Murmansk. But no, Southwind made a sharp turn north and took a wide loop through the Barents Sea. Somewhere near Spitsbergen, the captain seemed to have had enough of the Arctic and decided to head south. And here, as he approached Norway again, it was as if someone called out to him, or rather, sent a message over the radio. It's time to go to Murmansk. Permission was given. Let's say, the Russians agreed. So, he made a sharp 90-degree turn, shown in yellow. I should also note that this was officially described as a rest stop for the crew. But Tromsø is a more inviting city. Look it up online, and you'll see what a paradise it is. Moreover, it has a Western lifestyle. I won't comment on whether that lifestyle is good or bad, but these were Western sailors accustomed to their way of life. And yet, instead of staying in Tromsø, they traveled 1,000 kilometers to Murmansk. What was the purpose? Here is an enlarged view of this part of the Murmansk turn. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow announced that south wind would remain in Murmansk from Saturday to Monday so the crew could have a shore leave to rest and unwind, and that this was merely a goodwill visit, nothing more. To truly relax and unwind, Tromsø would probably have been a better choice. Especially considering that heading south from the north, if you turn right from Tromsø, it gets warmer. If you turn left, that is, east, it gets colder. Nevertheless, the ship allegedly came on a goodwill visit. Among American researchers, including Zheleznyakov, there is the idea that her presence there was somewhat coincidental. She was exploring, sailing around, and weaving patterns in the Barents Sea when supposedly the Russians informed them. "We have a capsule here. Since you happened to be nearby in the sea, come and pick it up." I'm not being sarcastic. This is roughly the narrative. Thanks to colleagues Bulatov and Vizitov, who noted a very interesting detail that demonstrates the visit to Murmansk was, in fact, pre-planned. The ship was prepared for it even before departing the warm shores of America on June 15. There was no improvisation. Look, on the left is the standard appearance of the ship's bow. At the front is a large 6-inch gun, approximately 10 centimeters in caliber. This makes sense. Coast Guard ships might encounter violators they need to deal with. But the ship arrived in Murmansk without her gun. Did they toss it overboard along the way? Unlikely. It was removed before departure. This suggests that while the captain may not have known he was specifically headed to Murmansk, this aligns with security protocols. It was clear that he had to take aboard some large, likely classified cargo. Southwind went to Murmansk for this large cargo, and the ship was prepped for this mission prior to departure. No improvisation here. The claim of a goodwill visit is what's improvised, it's deceit. Still, let's follow this storyline. The ceremonial part of the visit, the icebreaker, is already docked in Murmansk. The ceremonial boat of the deputy commander of the Soviet Northern Fleet, Rear Admiral Gar Kusha, pulls alongside the ship. 4 stripes, I believe, indicate his admiral rank. He is seen speaking with an American officer, likely the ship's captain. Sailors always have something to discuss. Later, a formal dinner will take place at the Rear Admiral's headquarters, which will undoubtedly be well organized. Russians know how to host, regardless of geography or external circumstances. And how did the crew unwind? The icebreaker has her own website where sailors post various memories and photos. Here are some photos. I've taken at least 50%, if not more. The rest are polar bears and ice. In Murmansk, they photographed the theater building, an empty stadium, and the city's deserted streets. It seems they were bored. They even photographed a receipt for exchanging dollars for rubles.
But that was a weekend, Alexander Ivanovich.
Yes, a weekend, and they had nothing to do. So why did the icebreaker come? We're getting to that. Once again, there was no improvisation. It was a planned visit. The business part of the visit. Let me hold your attention a little longer with this important document. The thing is, when a photograph, this one in particular, the key scene at the pier, gets passed from publication to publication, people eventually grow accustomed to it and think, oh, it's just some photo wandering around. Who knows where it's from? Colleague Vitaly Nasenyuk managed to contact the Hungarian Shuminsky and obtain documents confirming that this photograph was indeed taken by Hungarian journalists in 1970, and the copyright does not belong to TASS but to the Hungarian Telegraph Agency, MTI. MTI is the abbreviation for the Magyar Távirati Iroda, literally, Hungarian Telegraphic Office. On the left, you can see the official letterhead of the Hungarian agency, and on the right, I've enlarged it and rearranged the text to fit. Here's what the agency's editor writes. We confirm that the attached photograph was taken on September 8, 1970. Respectfully, Karoli Ottilin, editor. This is an official photograph belonging to the Hungarians. I want to emphasize once again that there isn't a single photograph like this in the Soviet Union. Another point to note. I think it's forgivable if people, 50 years after an event, shift the date by 2 days. The transfer occurred on September 6. Why can this be stated confidently? Many sources also mention the day of the week. If you check a calendar and match the days of the week with the dates, it lines up with the 6th, as indicated in the TASS report that went abroad. We didn't have any TASS reports about it ourselves. So, here is the scene. Sunday, September 6, the business part of the visit. At the bottom, there's a caption in Hungarian, which I show only to confirm that the photo was taken by Hungarians. Frankly, as a Russian and a Soviet citizen, this bothers me. How could this happen? Our people weren't allowed in, yet some Hungarians showed up. Our people should have been there first and foremost. But they weren't. Take note of the deserted pier. Sunday was chosen for a reason. There are fewer people in the port. Over there, a bright orange square is visible. 3 people are standing there, but they are not approaching. This implies that approaching is prohibited. For now, these are indirect signs. How does Zheleznyakov describe this scene? Here's my headline. On Sunday, September 6, on a deserted pier, with only one outsider present, and that a foreigner. I quote Zheleznyakov. In a ceremonial setting, the command module of the Apollo spacecraft was handed over to the officers of the Southwind. Apart from the interested parties, the only witness was Hungarian journalist Tamás Fehér, who even took a few photographs. From here, I will summarize Zheleznyakov for a simple reason. His account is overly detailed. 3 staff members from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow were present. William Harbin, no title mentioned, likely a highly secretive role. Franklin Babbitt, a naval attaché, and Richard M. Rodnia, a deputy military attaché. 3 diplomats. Isn't it too much of an honor for mere hardware? The capsule was loaded, and the Southwind departed. By the way, notice in the photo to the right the square base, which will be placed on a circular spot, exactly where a gun once stood. The return journey. The Southwind departed. Let's look at the yellow line. She came from the west, so presumably, she should head back west. But her behavior doesn't align with this. This slide I titled, Wading Through the Arctic Gardens. There is a Russian expression, to wade through the gardens, which has a clear origin. In a village with just one main street, everyone sees who is walking, where they're heading, and whose house they'll end up at. But if you wade through the gardens, you can slip by unnoticed. Notice, after leaving Murmansk, the Southwind went northeast, even though her home is westward, across the Atlantic, to your left. She rounded Novaya Zemlya from the north, looping back. Someone likely stopped her there, as this area marks the artery of the Northern Sea Route along the Soviet coastline. Up until now, I've presented facts. What follows is my hypothesis, shared by many colleagues. The Southwind intended to take the Northern Sea Route to approach the United States from the opposite direction, to remain less visible and to avoid Europe's scrutiny. But the Southwind was sent back, and eventually, she went back past the shores of Norway. Literally, just 2 slides. The voyage was extremely difficult. After all, this was the Arctic. Apollo, who was more accustomed to swimming in the warm waters of the oceans, was freezing. Sailors were chipping away ice. Eventually, it was time to return home to warmer waters. But she didn't return home immediately, coming back only in November or December. One could assume that this delay was to allow tensions to cool down. You know how it is. A scandal rages at first, and then it subsides. People find new concerns, new interests, both on a personal level and in high politics. The laws of psychology are the same everywhere. Let's return to September. The scandal in Washington followed immediately. Now I will quote Zheleznyakov. The scandal in Washington was enormous. Exactly 1 week after the capsule was handed over, Thomas Paine, who headed NASA during its heyday, resigned. Most likely, Paine's resignation was forced. Of course, it was forced. Rarely is anyone fired just like that. Usually, people resign voluntarily. Right? It's the same here as it is there. Let me clarify about Paine's heyday. It was under Paine that the most critical parts of the moon hoax were executed, from the supposed lunar flyby of Apollo 8 to the supposed lunar landing of Apollo 11. And Apollo 12 cemented this success. But with Apollo 13, something went wrong. In short, Paine resigned. Again, the question is, why? How were these events covered in the media? I draw attention to how Zheleznyakov titled his publication on this episode, "A Forgotten Episode of the Cold War." As if to say, it was remembered and then forgotten amidst other matters. But how can you forget what you didn't know? I am a witness of that time. In 1970, I was 27 years old, already a mature person. None of this happened. So, the maestro is being a bit sly here. In the USSR, there wasn't even a TASS report about it, which is where everything should have started. Let me explain. TASS reports always covered important events. They were brief and signed, TASS. This unmistakably indicated that it was an announcement from the government, the Central Committee of the CPSU, the highest authorities. After that, the same newspaper might contain additional information about the event, but never before. First came the TASS report, followed by all subsequent information. There was no such TASS report. I say this as a living witness. Now, I'd like to quote a letter from a colleague, Vitaly Nasenyuk. I admire the persistence of many of my colleagues. He wrote this in January 2014. We searched through our newspapers for the TASS report about the Murmansk episode. We visited libraries, browsed through archives. The newspapers were there, all the pages intact, but the TASS report wasn't there. I learned that all TASS documents from that period had been transferred to the State Archive of the Russian Federation. I wrote to them and attached their reply. Let's look at the reply. I treated it the same way. It's a mostly blank form with small print that would be unreadable here. I enlarged the content of the letter but left only the header from the form. The reply was received by Vitaly on November 13, 2014. Dear Vitaly Gennadievich, in response to your inquiry, we inform you that a page-by-page review of TASS documents stored in the State Archive of the Russian Federation did not reveal any information about a decision by the USSR to transfer some equipment launched under the Apollo program to the United States. Respectfully, Head of Department, Malyshenko, Executor, Vladimirtseva. Apologies for being persistent, but I often mention the TASS report. Now, we will focus solely on the TASS report that went there and was never published here. That report was sent via UPI, United Press International, their news agency. Therefore, the information comes from UPI TASS. So, we didn't have the report. But what was it like in America? It must be said that the Americans were very skilled at creating an illusion of openness, managing to speak while saying nothing. Firstly, the general campaign for openness was delegated to the local press. Some of these media outlets served towns with populations of just 6,000 people. A colleague working abroad mentions the town of Tipton. About 10 years ago, my colleagues Mezuyev and Bulatov conducted this search. At the time, they discovered 21 local newspapers. Let's conclude with the local press. On the right are two pieces of news. There's that very photo we've already seen with a caption beneath it, stating that Soviet representatives will hand over an Apollo capsule to the Americans. On the right, I labeled this as a piece of information among chicken legs. Imagine, for example, you're looking for cheaper chicken legs. Would you really pay attention to the small blue square I've marked? That's the information about the Murmansk episode. I think you'd find out where the chicken legs are cheaper and rush there, while the Murmansk episode would remain uninteresting to you. The central media, radio, television, and newspapers completely ignored the TASS UPI report, except for one publication, the New York Times. Here it is on the left. The New York Times, as far as I know, has about 30 pages, right? It's a solid publication. How did it respond? In the September 5, 1970 issue, on the 16th page, there are stock market news unrelated to this episode. Do you see the small blue square in the far left corner? That's a retelling of the TASS report that came through UPI. I emphasize, it's a recap. Studying the press, you realize everyone lies or omits things, but each does so in their own way. Therefore, by comparing sources, you can glean something. The result of this openness was as follows. An American, Mark Wade, writes, "The truth only emerged 32 years later." So, the event occurred in 1970, and in 2002 Wade wrote about it. I labeled this information as the paradoxes of the esteemed Alexander Zheleznyakov. Can one person write that the Earth is a sphere and a few lines later write that, actually, the Earth is flat? An intelligent person wouldn't. And Zheleznyakov cannot be denied intelligence, knowledge, erudition, or information. So, if such paradoxes exist, it means there's a reluctance to tell the truth. Now, I quote Zheleznyakov. Neither the Soviet nor the American side made a secret of the fact that the capsule was handed over. Yet a few lines later, he writes, "I will only add that documents regarding the events preceding the ceremony in Murmansk are supposed to be declassified around 2021 unless a decision is made to extend the classification period." 2021 has passed. Have you seen or heard anything? I haven't.
Did he say this in 2002?
Yes, he said that in 2002. It's easy to say, in 20 years, and leave it at that. Go ahead and try to verify it. Well, time flies. The year 2021 came and went, and nothing changed. And just think about it from a human perspective. Look, it's 1970. The people who stood on the dock, the reporters walking around, how old are they now? Back then, the men involved were 30 to 40 years old, in their prime. I'm not even counting anyone older. Half a century has passed, now they're 80 to 90 years old. Do you think they're interested in dealing with declassifying documents that might have already been eaten by mice? So, effectively, the documents about this event were classified forever, and if it weren't for the Hungarians and Shuminsky, we wouldn't know anything about it. Here's another clarifying detail. 2021 minus 1970 is 51 years. I asked two acquaintances who are KGB veteran officers, what level of secrecy does such a timeframe correspond to? They both independently told me, it would be classified at least as top secret. I didn't ask them together, each replied separately. Now let's take a closer look at this capsule. Here's the testimony of a specialist from the RDA of Machine Manufacturing, Anatoly Blagov. I won't even decode the name of this organization. It's located nearby, in Rayatov, Moscow region. This is all open information. Let me mention their signature project. Everyone probably knows the Proton rocket. That's their development. For half a century now, it's been serving us reliably, continuously improved, of course. The company does significant work for our defense needs. By the time Blagov himself visited Murmansk in 1970, he had already been working at the company for 10 years. In other words, he wasn't new to this field. I became familiar with information about him when he had already been at the company for 50 years. During all this time, he specialized in re-entry modules. So, if something fell from space, he would figure out what that fallen object had gone through. He writes, "It was a well-made mock-up of the Apollo capsule, constructed from thick galvanized iron. Of course, a mock-up, because no spacecraft is made of iron, they're made of aluminum alloys. But buckets, for example, are made of iron. At my cottage, my buckets and watering cans are all made of galvanized iron. We only received the light beacon key," he adds. This is an important detail. If this empty bucket had a beacon, it must have been significant in some way. It means it wasn't completely empty, there was something valuable in it. The Americans picked up and examined such buckets. Pay attention to the hatch. This isn't the hatch of a spacecraft. It's bolted shut with 20 to 30 bolts. It's a container. It can be opened and closed. A wooden container can be nailed shut. That's the kind of description this capsule had. And now, some questions. The technical novelty of such a capsule for our developers is close to zero. It's essentially a jettisoned sealed iron container. After use, its value is close to that of scrap metal. Based on my assessment, its current value by our prices would be around $300 to $600. For comparison, the operational cost of the ship that retrieved this capsule, the Southwind, is about 200 times higher, between $60,000 and $80,000 per day. Thanks to Bulatov and ChatGPT for this information. So how do we explain this? Let's review what we know. A first-class military ship of the U.S. Coast Guard, a national security cutter, arrives to pick up the capsule. 3 American diplomats come from Moscow, allegedly to record some identification number from this iron bucket, which is to be sent to Washington. There, they would check the registry and confirm what had been lost. As if the ship's captain or any officer, if not entrusted to the sailors, couldn't write down the number and send it by radio. What is so secret about this? The diplomats came for negotiations, to assess the situation on the ground, and to resolve something. A grand scandal erupts in Washington. Just a week after the events in Murmansk, the head of NASA resigns. Apparently, he hoped to sit it out, but whatever the diplomats saw and reported back made it clear, Payne had to go. Of course, he left with honors and medals, all formally proper. Soviet correspondents were not invited, but a Hungarian photojournalist was present. And finally, the entire story was classified for 51 years, effectively forever. Let me remind you of a well-known truth: 90% of classified information, sometimes said to be 80%, or even 95%, is obtained through reading and correlating open sources. We are reading open sources. Here are a few newspapers and excerpts from articles. Washington UPI reports. The Russians said Friday they were returning an experimental U.S. space capsule, which was launched under the Apollo program. It will be transferred to U.S. representatives. In the context of space exploration, this phrase has only one interpretation: launched by rocket. Not by plane or shot from a cannon. Launched unequivocally means launched by rocket. Another newspaper states, a 3-paragraph announcement by TASS, which we cannot read, as it isn't available to us, Friday afternoon gave the first inkling the Russians had any U.S. space gear. Then the article includes a subsection titled, Fallen from Space. These articles are fairly extensive, and they can be found in Bulatov's article, The Odyssey of Apollo 13. Under the subsection, Fallen from Space, it says, the Soviets did tell us about 2 weeks ago they had something of ours that had fallen from space. Once again, during the preparation of manned missions, nothing falls from space. Capsules are lifted by aircraft. Where else? Probably nowhere else. They're simply dropped from a ship into the sea to see if they'll float. Nothing falls from space, neither theirs nor ours. The key to understanding. Let's combine these phrases, and then it sounds like this. It was a space capsule, launched by a rocket as part of the Apollo program, and it fell from space. Now, let's compare this to what we officially know. In 1970, NASA launched only one space capsule under the Apollo program. This happened on April 11, and it was Apollo 13. Therefore, this is what fell from space. It didn't go to the moon, it fell from space into the Atlantic. If you recall, in one of our previous discussions, I mentioned that these grandiose American rockets completed their journey shortly after disappearing from view of the launch site. They couldn't go further. They merely simulated a launch and ended their voyage in the Atlantic. But that's an additional point. The important thing is that the only capsule that could have fallen from space was Apollo 13. Thus, TASS essentially informed Washington that on September 6, 1970, at the Murmansk pier, the Southwind would receive the Apollo 13 capsule. This is my illustration. We've already seen this at the very beginning. The Apollo 13, Saturn V rocket supposedly launches to the moon. The entire rocket is 100 meters tall, and at the very top, where the arrow points, is a small conical section. Apparently, under a small shroud, this gray bucket is hidden, not astronauts. It's this bucket that our specialists would retrieve. Now let's summarize this decision. The Soviet leadership demonstrated that it had physical evidence of the falsification of the moon landings. I emphasize, physical evidence. There had been many arguments before, waving flags, odd videos, and so on. But physical evidence, like what we found in the Atlantic, is unique. This evidence could be used for exposure, or it could remain unused. Alternatively, it could be exchanged for friendship and positive long-term relations. 1970 was the prelude to the détente policy that would explode in 1972, with Nixon and Brezhnev practically embracing. At that point, the Murmansk episode would forever remain a secret. That was essentially the position of our leadership. Détente indeed occurred, and the episode remained forever classified. But through our joint efforts, we've uncovered it. In reality, the Soviet leadership would sell itself short, though this would become clear much later. Meanwhile, the Americans were outraged. This led to a massive scandal in Washington and the resignation of NASA's head. 3 American diplomats immediately arrived in Murmansk to assess the situation. The Soviet side invited the Hungarians, and by mutual agreement, the curtain of secrecy was drawn over the entire story. It is crucial to emphasize that this was a mutual agreement. This can be stated with confidence because such a secret, accessible to the top leadership of both sides, could not be preserved without the consent of the other party. I would like to share some thoughts on the special operation that led to the Apollo capsule ending up on the Murmansk dock. When Anatoly Blagov described the Apollo capsule to us as an empty iron bucket, he remarked, "We, specialists, came to take a look at this gift of fate." Naturally, as a rocket specialist, he didn't know how the capsule ended up there. He might have guessed, but he didn't know for sure. Zheleznyakov writes, and he cannot avoid writing this. Most specialists believe that these events were the result of a successfully conducted special operation. So, it wasn't a gift of fate but rather the success of a special operation. Let's think in clear, logical terms, which I believe we all can follow. To catch something in the ocean, you need to know the approximate area where it fell, right? For instance, if I were a senior intelligence officer and a political leader summoned me, saying that Apollos were falling into the Atlantic and one needed to be captured, my response would be, "The Atlantic is vast. At least give me an approximate area, and then I can organize a special operation to catch it. This means the area of the fall must be determined, and only then can a special operation be organized. I won't delve into this part. My colleagues have done extensive work on it, but it's a tricky topic, hard to substantiate with facts. Again, I'd recommend reading Bulatov's works. Perhaps we could provide a list of 5 to 7 publications for reference. It's clear that the operation was a success, as the capsule did indeed end up on the dock. Another key point: it's not enough to catch it, the catch must also be delivered to Murmansk. Don't forget that the United States had, and still has, the most powerful navy in the world. At the time, it was formidable as well. If, for example, a trawler had unexpectedly found the catch, and this version does exist, it would have been stopped immediately or given a kick in the ass, move on. After all, it would have to navigate through straits and seas swarming with US ships. But this time, the situation was different. Here's why. On the left is a map of Cape Canaveral, highlighted in green. Cape Canaveral is where Apollo missions were launched. However, in reality, they launched from the small red square, a site reserved for NASA. NASA is essentially a branch of the US Air Force, and the rest of the green area is a vast military launch site used for testing the most advanced intercontinental missiles for both the Air Force and the Navy. On the right is a photograph of this site. You can see dozens of launch towers, and in the far north, the area marked by a square is reserved for NASA launches. This is a massive military spaceport. And since it's a military site, our reconnaissance ships had to be stationed nearby. Monitoring rocket launches was part of their job, and they recorded the necessary data. So, why did the Americans build their spaceport by the coast? It was constructed in 1957-58, maybe even slightly earlier. At that time, the Americans didn't yet seriously consider the Soviet Union as a threat. They believed that being separated by oceans made them unreachable. But by the 1960s and 70s, the situation had changed. Here's how launches looked back then. In this photo, to the left, is our reconnaissance ship Harid and Laptev. It was the pride and glory of our intelligence fleet. Unfortunately, it has now rusted away and been scrapped. Nothing has replaced it. It was the lead ship of its series, built in 1965. Before that, smaller vessels repurposed for this function served the same purpose. But this was a specialized ship. Even the smaller ones fulfilled their duty. Here it is, capturing images. What does it mean for a reconnaissance ship to monitor NASA's Apollo launches from Cape Canaveral? These ships would stay on station near the Cape for 6 months at a time. They might drift slightly north along the coast, but often they didn't need to. Everything was visible from there. Here's an example, a nighttime rocket launch from NASA's spaceport. Now, as an optics specialist, I can explain something. If the trajectory of the flight isn't long range, and in this case it wasn't, rockets also transmit telemetry data during flight. This signal can be intercepted. It might not be decrypted, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that the signal can be tracked. As it happened, Apollo 13 launched on April 11, and on April 14, the largest naval exercises in world history began, conducted by our Soviet Navy. At that time, the Soviet Navy had reached parity with the American Navy. Again, I don't know if there's any connection, but the fact is that our ships didn't leave port on April 14. They were already in their designated positions in the Atlantic where the exercises would take place. In other words, the Atlantic was under our control. The deployment included 80 submarines, 19 of which were nuclear-powered, 84 surface ships, and 45 auxiliary vessels, essential for any fleet's operations. In total, 209 military ships entered the Atlantic. Additionally, over 20 aviation regiments were deployed to monitor the situation from above. Compare that power to the current state, or lack thereof, and you'll see we had the resources to protect a special cargo. I'll conclude this account of the second mysterious event. Acquiring material evidence, such as the Apollo 13 capsule, and choosing not to use it to expose the moon landings in exchange for illusory hopes of long-term friendship with the USA. This was the second puzzling decision by the Soviet leadership. On a personal note, I'll add this. When someone grovels before another, they will never gain their friendship. Those who grovel are always exploited, and as soon as they're no longer useful, they're discarded. The same applies to relations between states. That's my modern understanding of this inexplicable decision. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Applause.
Well, if I deserved it, thank you.